Alright, so let's break down the key points of what's happening here. Yeah, Joe Biden, the President of the United States, is pushing for a ceasefire in Gaza. After the killing of Yahya Sinwar, who was a major Hamas leader and the mastermind behind the deadly 7th October attack on Israel, Biden called Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and said, essentially, it's time to move forward. He congratulated Netanyahu on the operation but emphasized the need to progress toward a ceasefire. Sinwar's death is a big deal because he's considered to have had a lot of blood on his hands, American blood, Israeli blood, and more. So you can see why Biden's congratulating Netanyahu for this. Now, if we look at Biden's overall tone, he seems cautiously optimistic. You can sense it when he says he's more hopeful about a ceasefire. He's even planning to send Secretary of State Antony Blinken to Israel soon to help mediate things. This is happening as other world leaders like Vice President Kamala Harris, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron, and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz are all urging for Blinken had toward ending the conflict. Key figures in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia's foreign minister and Qatar's prime minister, both essential players when it comes to resolving the situation in Gaza. Their involvement highlights how global this issue is. The United States, of course, plays a huge role in shaping the future of the conflict, but they are definitely not alone. Okay, now, let's switch gears to Iran. They came out strong after Sinwar's killing, calling it something that would only embolden the spirit of resistance. Hezbollah, an Iranian-backed group in Lebanon, even declared that this marks a new, more intense phase in their confrontation with Israel. You can see how killing Sinwar is not just about removing one leader, it could stir up even more unrest and violence. That's one of the reasons world leaders are calling for a ceasefire. There's a real risk this could escalate further. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Netanyahu's reaction to Sinwar's death is both confident and grim. He's calling it the beginning of the end of the war with Hamas, but made it clear that Israel isn't letting up anytime soon. His message is that this war is costly but necessary and Israel is prepared to stand firm. He's using Sinwar's death to rally his people, emphasizing that those who try to harm Israel will face serious consequences. It's a tough, resolute stance, reflecting that Israel is committed to its military objectives in Gaza. What's worth noting is that analysts are suggesting Israel's plan in Gaza isn't likely to shift dramatically after Sinwar's killing. The occupation of Gaza and ongoing military operations appear to be the main focus for the time being. So despite this big event, the larger strategy remains. But what comes next, especially when it comes to a long-term solution or the day after the conflict, as Biden alluded to, is still up in the air. Speaking of Biden again, before heading to Germany, he talked about a potential day after scenario where Gaza no longer has Hamas in control. That's a big shift, right? The idea of Gaza without Hamas is huge because Hamas has held power there for years, and their removal could open the door to new political settlements. Biden is framing Sinwar's death as a step toward that future, although he's also very clear that this isn't over yet. There's still a lot of work to do. Okay, let's talk more about Blinken's role here. He didn't hold back either, calling Sinwar a vicious and unrepentant terrorist who had consistently blocked efforts to end the war. Yeah, Blinken's point is that Sinwar was a major roadblock to peace, refusing negotiations that might have led to the return of hostages and the easing of suffering for Palestinians. His words signal how deeply the US is involved in trying to end the conflict diplomatically while also standing by Israel's right to defend itself. On the ground in Gaza, though, things are very different. The people there are reacting to Sinwar's assassination with a mix of fear and resignation. Many civilians in Gaza, like Amal al-Hanawi, were shocked by the killing and are wondering what comes next. Her comment about Hamas being over reflects a sense that the resistance might be crumbling, which is exactly what Netanyahu would want, but others like Shadi Nofal are just exhausted by the war, hoping the world will step in and help bring it to an end. Who hold on to the belief that the resistance will continue no matter who is killed. This sense of resilience is deeply ingrained in some parts of Palestinian society. And it's true that movements like Hamas don't simply disappear with the loss of one leader. New figures often rise up and the cycle of conflict can continue. Sinwar's assassination might be a significant blow, but it doesn't necessarily mean the resistance or the war itself is over. In fact, some people in Gaza and elsewhere are praising Sinwar for fighting until the end, like Ahmed Omar, who said Sinwar would be remembered as a leader who died on the battlefield. This shows that for some, Sinwar's death might even strengthen their resolve to keep fighting, which could mean more challenges ahead for any efforts toward peace. Back in Israel, the families of hostages taken by Hamas are reacting in complex ways. Avi Marciano, whose daughter was killed while held by Hamas, called Sinwar's death a kind of justice but emphasized that there won't be real closure until the hostages are safely returned. That's a sentiment shared by many in Israel, who see the removal of Sinwar as just one step in a long process of getting their loved ones back and ending the war. And then there's the broader Israeli public's reaction. Some Israelis, like Hemda, are celebrating Sinwar's death, seeing it as a win for Israel and a step toward peace. Others, like Sissel, are more focused on the opportunity this presents to negotiate a hostage deal that could bring the war to an end. It's clear that there's a mix of emotions in Israel right now: relief at Sinwar's death, hope for peace, but also an understanding that the conflict isn't over yet. Finally, we can't ignore the scale of this conflict. The war in Gaza started with Hamas's attack on southern Israel on 7th October, which left 1,200 people dead and 250 hostages taken. Israel's response has been devastating, with at least 42,438 people killed in Gaza, most of them civilians, according to figures from the Gaza Health Ministry. The scale of suffering on both sides is immense, and it's why there's such an urgent call for a ceasefire from the international community. So yeah, that's where things stand. The death of Yahya Sinwar is a significant event, but it's not the end of the conflict. The fighting continues, the hostages are still held, and the future of Gaza and Israel remains uncertain. And what happens next will depend on the actions of world leaders, the resilience of those on the ground, and whether diplomacy can finally bring an end to this brutal war.